The auctioneer looked around the room. Nobody moved. Then one hand went up, and everyone laughed. But the old farmer in the third row wasn't laughing. 12 months earlier, this same young man stood at the edge of a dying farm, watching white dust settle on everything his family had ever built. 12 months earlier, Silas Cobb stood at the edge of a dying farm, watching white dust settle on everything his family had ever built. Not snow, not frost. Limestone dust, calcium carbonate, ground so fine it floated like talcum powder on the summer air, drifting down from the ridge in pale curtains every time the wind shifted south. It coated the blueberry bushes until their leaves looked frosted in July. It filmed across the surface of the old stock pond until the water went milky, opaque, like someone had poured a gallon of chalk paint into it and walked away. It settled into the creases of Silas's faded olive-green canvas jacket, gathered in the seams of his scuffed brown work boots, and dusted the small black composition notebook he pulled from his back left pocket every morning to record what was dying next. That morning, it was the Chandler blueberries along the south fence. 23 bushes, every single one showing the same thing. Leaves curling inward at the tips, turning a sickly yellow-green that had no business appearing on a plant that was supposed to be deep emerald this time of year. He crouched down, pale green eyes narrowing, and pressed 2 fingers into the soil at the base of the nearest bush. It felt wrong. Not the cool, dark, crumbly loam he'd grown up sinking his hands into. This was chalky, pale, almost powdery at the surface, like the earth itself was being slowly bleached from the outside in. He wrote one word in the notebook: dying. However, to understand what that word cost him, what it cost all 3 of them, you need to understand what this farm used to be. The Cobb place sat in a shallow valley in the Blue Ridge foothills. 42 acres of south-facing slopes and creek-fed bottomland that had been growing things since before Silas's grandmother first drove a shovel into it. Alma Cobb built the greenhouse in 1981 with lumber she'd milled herself from storm-downed oaks and plastic sheeting she'd bartered for with a neighbor who owed her a favor. That greenhouse, patched, leaning slightly to the east now, held together by stubbornness and 16-gauge wire, was where Silas first learned to taste soil. He was maybe 5 or 6 when Alma pressed a pinch of dark earth to his lower lip and told him to hold it on his tongue. She was already in her 60s then, silver-gray hair tied in that low bun at the nape of her neck, deep brown eyes watching him with a patience that made him feel like the most important person alive. She had her brass soil knife in one hand, the one with the wooden handle, the one she still carried in her cardigan pocket every single day, and she waited. "What do you taste?" "Dirt," he'd said. "No, try again. Slower." And he did. And after a moment, he tasted something faintly sour, almost tangy, like the ghost of a lemon rind buried deep in the mineral darkness. "That's acid," Alma told him. "That's what blueberries dream about." The Cobb farm soil was naturally acidic, pH hovering around 4.8 to 5.2. Perfect for the berries and the strawberries and the heirloom tomatoes that June Cobb had built an entire small business around. June, Silas's mother, ran the operation essentially alone after Silas's father left when Silas was 11. Fair pinkish skin weathered by years of sun. Auburn hair pulled back in that low ponytail. Hazel eyes with green flecks that could go warm or absolutely ice cold, depending on whether you were being honest with her. She wore her thin gold wedding band on her right hand now, moved from the left. A reminder, not a sentiment. June had turned 42 acres of hill country loam into something remarkable. Cherokee purple tomatoes that 3 restaurants in Asheville put on their menus by name. Chandler and Duke blueberries that sold out at the Saturday farmers market before 9 a.m. Strawberries so fragrant that customers would stop mid-sentence when they opened the carton. This wasn't hobby farming. This was a livelihood. Tight margins, sure, but real. Enough to keep the lights on, keep Alma in her medications, keep Silas fed and clothed and dreaming about what he might do with the land someday. Then Ridgeback Materials showed up on the ridge. The quarry had existed for decades, a small limestone operation, barely noticeable, run by a local family who blasted maybe twice a month and kept to themselves. But 3 years before that morning, when Silas crouched by his dying blueberries, the operation changed hands. Ridgeback Materials acquired the mineral rights, expanded the permit, and brought in Dale Schuster to run things. Dale Schuster. Broad-shouldered, stocky, 6 feet of deliberate heaviness in a khaki button-down with that Ridgeback Materials logo patch on the left breast pocket. Salt and pepper hair receding above gray-blue eyes that looked at you like you were a line item on a spreadsheet he was about to cross out. Silver ballpoint pen always clipped to his shirt pocket. Arms always folded. The man stood in the Cobb driveway exactly once, early on, when June went up to the quarry office to complain about the dust, and he drove down to address her concerns personally. He looked at the blueberry rows, looked at the greenhouse with its patched plastic sheeting, looked at June with her arms crossed and her jaw set. And he said, and Silas heard every word of this standing 12 feet away, "Ma'am, I understand you're worried about your little garden here, but we're operating within every parameter the county set. If your topsoil can't handle a little calcium, maybe the problem isn't us." Your little garden. He called 42 acres of specialty produce, 3 generations of knowledge, of labor, of love poured into dirt. A little garden. Like it was a window box. Like June was fussing over petunias. That silver pen caught the light when he tapped it against his folded arms. Dismissive. Almost bored. June went to the town council. 3 times. She brought soil samples in mason jars, lined them up on the public comment table, showed the shift from dark loam to chalky gray. She brought air quality readings she'd paid for out of pocket, $400 she couldn't afford. She wrote letters to the county environmental office, to the state DEQ, to anyone with a title and a mailbox. Every single report came back the same way. Particulate levels within legal limits. Dust mitigation plan approved and on file. No violation found. The system wasn't broken. That's the thing. The system was working exactly as designed. And it was designed to make limestone dust from a $1 million quarry operation, technically, legally, on paper, fine. Even as it killed everything it touched. The blueberries went first. Then the strawberries started producing fruit that was mealy, pale, flavorless, like the sweetness had been leached right out of them. The Cherokee purples, those legendary tomatoes, began cracking on the vine, their flesh turning bland and watery. Restaurant clients noticed. Of course they noticed. One by one, the orders slowed, then stopped. The Saturday market customers started walking past the Cobb table with apologetic smiles. Because here's what calcium carbonate does to acidic soil. And I want you to picture this. Imagine your soil is a battery, charged with a specific acid balance that lets blueberries pull iron and manganese and all the micronutrients they need right out of the ground. Now imagine someone slowly, steadily, week after week, pouring powdered antacid into that battery. The pH climbs. 5.2 becomes 5.8, then 6.1, then 6.5. The nutrients lock up. They're still in the soil, but the plants can't access them anymore. It's like starving someone in a locked grocery store. Everything they need is right there. They just can't reach it. Every morning, Alma walked the rows a little slower. 74 years old, petite and slightly stooped, her worn white canvas slip-on shoes leaving shallow prints in dust that shouldn't have been there. She'd stop at a plant, pull her brass soil knife from her cardigan pocket, and press the flat of the blade into the earth. Then she'd pinch the soil between her thumb and forefinger, roll it slowly, bring it close to her face. Sometimes she'd hold it to her lips, tasting, listening. Her deep brown eyes would close, and she'd stay like that for 10, 15 seconds, perfectly still. One morning, Silas found her standing at the end of the strawberry row, just standing there, hands clasped in front of her, staring at nothing. "Gran?" She didn't turn right away. When she did, the faint birthmark on her left jaw caught the early light, and her expression was something Silas had never seen on her face before. Not sadness, bewilderment, like the earth had started speaking a language she didn't recognize. "Soil talks in whispers," she said quietly. "Most people are too loud to hear it." She paused. "But this soil isn't whispering anymore, Silas. It's going quiet. And that's worse." Revenue had fallen by a third. June sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open and said nothing. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was the soil itself. Something in it was changing, and nobody was listening. Early May. Silas was clearing a collapsed section of old stone wall along the east boundary, the side closest to the quarry, where the dust was thickest. Now here's what you need to understand about this wall. It had been standing for over 100 years. Stacked fieldstone, no mortar. The kind of wall that old-timers built when they were pulling rocks out of pasture and needed somewhere to put them. Half of it had buckled inward over the winter, and the stones were scattered across a strip of ground that hadn't been touched, hadn't been tilled, hadn't been walked on in decades. The wall had sheltered it. Leaf litter had piled against it every autumn. Grass clippings from the mower had blown up against the base year after year. And all that time, the limestone dust from the quarry had been settling on top of everything else. Silas grabbed a stone, rolled it aside, and stopped. The soil underneath was black. Not brown. Not the tired, chalky gray of everything else on the Cobb property. Black. Almost wet-looking, even though it hadn't rained in 4 days. He knelt down, pale green eyes narrowing, sandy brown hair catching the late morning light, and pushed his fingers into it. The earth gave way like cake. Loose, crumbly, cool to the touch. It didn't compact. It didn't powder. It held together in soft aggregates that broke apart between his thumb and forefinger, and when he lifted a handful to his face, it smelled alive. That deep, sweet, fungal smell. Like a forest floor after rain. Like something growing instead of dying. He dug deeper. Earthworms. Dozens of them. Fat, pink, slow-moving, threading through the dark matrix in every direction. And then he saw it, growing right out of the rubble, pushing up between 2 fallen stones with a stem thick as his wrist. A volunteer squash plant. Nobody planted it. No one watered it. A seed from the compost pile or a passing bird had landed in this strip of forgotten ground, and it had exploded. Dark green leaves the size of dinner plates, tendrils already reaching for the next stone. The thing looked healthier than anything in the main fields, healthier than anything Silas had seen on the farm in years. He sat back on his heels, pulled the small black-covered composition notebook from his back left pocket, and he wrote one line. Soil under east wall. Different. Why? That question changed everything. But not yet. Not for weeks. Because Silas didn't trust his own eyes. He trusted data. So the next morning, he got on the old 10-speed that leaned against the barn and pedaled 11 miles to the county extension office in Harlan. The woman at the desk, a soil scientist named Dr. Fay Renner, who'd been running the office for 15 years, looked up when this wiry, lean-muscled 19-year-old walked in with dirt still under his fingernails and asked if she had any bulletins on calcium carbonate as a soil amendment. She gave him 6. He read them on the floor of the office lobby because he didn't want to wait until he got home. And what he found in those bulletins turned the whole story sideways. Calcium carbonate, limestone dust, powdered rock. The exact substance that Ridgeback Materials had been blanketing the Cobb farm with for years was one of the most widely used soil amendments in agriculture. Farmers paid money for it. They bought it by the ton. It raised pH in acidic soils. It improved calcium availability. It enhanced microbial activity. Mixed with organic matter and given time, it created some of the richest, most productive growing conditions you could ask for. Read that again. The dust that was killing the Cobb farm was, in a different context, something people purchased on purpose. However, and this is the turn, the problem was never the limestone itself. The problem was bare soil with nothing to buffer it. Out in the open fields, where the Cobbs grew their lettuce and kale and root vegetables, the quarry dust landed on exposed ground. No leaf litter, no compost layer, no organic matter to absorb and integrate it. Just naked dirt getting coated in calcium carbonate over and over until the pH spiked so high that nutrients locked up and roots couldn't function. The dust wasn't poison. It was medicine, delivered without a body strong enough to process it. But behind that old stone wall, decades of fallen leaves, grass clippings, decomposing organic material, all of it quietly composting, all of it mixing with the limestone dust in exactly the right ratio, in exactly the right conditions. Nature had been running the experiment for 100 years, and the result was that black, worm-rich, impossibly fertile soil that Silas had pushed his fingers into. The villain wasn't what everyone thought it was. He biked home with those bulletins rolled up in his back pocket, right next to the composition notebook, and he didn't say a word to anyone. Not to June, who was inside reconciling invoices with that thin gold wedding band catching the kitchen light every time she turned a page. Not to Alma, who was sitting on the porch with her brass soil knife resting on the arm of her chair, watching the quarry trucks grind past like she'd been watching them for years, which she had. Silas went behind the barn. There was a strip of unused ground back there, maybe 40 feet long and 10 feet wide, hidden from the house by the barn itself and from the road by a stand of old cedars. He marked out 4 test beds, each one 4 feet by 8 feet, and he started layering. First, quarry dust. He scooped it from the drifts along the fence line, the same powder that had been suffocating the main fields. He spread it an inch thick across each bed. Second, composted vegetable scraps from the kitchen pile that nobody had touched since winter. Third, aged manure from the Hessler dairy operation 2 miles down the road. Old Garland Hessler let him load up the truck bed for free, didn't even ask why. Fourth, leaf mold. Bags and bags of it, raked from the tree line along the north side of the property. He layered them like lasagna: dust, compost, manure, leaf mold. Dust, compost, manure, leaf mold. Then he turned the beds with a fork. Every week he turned them again. The cheap pH testing kit he'd ordered from a garden supply catalog, $4.60, the only money he spent, told him what he needed to know. Week 1, pH too high. Week 3, dropping. Week 5, approaching neutral. The calcium carbonate was integrating. The organic matter was doing its job. Every measurement went into the black composition notebook. Dates, pH readings, temperature, moisture levels, observations about worm activity and fungal growth. Page after page in small, careful handwriting. And if you'd seen those pages, if you'd held that notebook and flipped through it, you'd have noticed something. The format, the abbreviations, the way he logged soil conditions in tight columns with dates in the left margin. It was exactly how Alma did it. Exactly. The same brass knife and notebook discipline his grandmother had kept for 50 years, passed down not through instruction, but through watching. Through sitting beside her on the porch as she recorded rainfall and soil color, and which beds drained fastest after a storm. He never asked her to teach him. He just absorbed it. And now, behind the barn where nobody could see, he was putting it to work. Within 8 weeks, his test beds produced lettuce twice the size of anything in the main fields. He had proof. But proof, on a farm this broke, is just paper unless someone listens. And nobody was going to listen to what he did next. Silas walked into the kitchen one evening in late June, set his black composition notebook on the table, and told his mother he wanted to stop fighting the quarry. June Cobb didn't move. Her hands stayed on her hips, the thin gold wedding band catching the overhead light. She stood there in her faded burgundy flannel rolled to the elbows, straight-backed and rigid, and for about 4 seconds, the only sound in that kitchen was the tick of the wall clock and the hum of a refrigerator that was 15 years past its warranty. Then she said, "You want to help them." Not a question, an accusation. And Silas, pale green eyes steady, sandy brown hair still damp from washing the field dust off his face, said, "No, I want to use them." But June didn't hear that second part. Not really. Because in her mind, the quarry was the thing that cracked the foundation of the barn. The quarry was the reason the well water tasted like chalk for 3 straight summers. The quarry was the reason her husband's lungs gave out at 44, though the doctors would never put it on paper that way. Dale Schuster's operation had been grinding rock a half-mile from their property line for over a decade, and every single thing it touched, it broke. And now her own son, standing in her kitchen with soil still under his fingernails, and that little black composition notebook full of numbers she couldn't argue with, was telling her to open the door and invite the damage in. "You want to help them?" she said again, louder this time, arms crossing tight against her chest. Silas didn't flinch. He just opened the notebook to a page near the back and slid it across the table. However, here's where it got complicated. Because convincing June was the easy part. Alma Cobb sat in the corner chair by the window, silver-gray hair tied in her low bun, her small brass soil knife resting in the pocket of her navy cardigan the way it always did, like a talisman. Her deep brown eyes tracked the notebook as it crossed the table, but she didn't reach for it. Didn't need to. She'd been farming this land since before June was born. She'd planted the first blueberry bushes with her own hands in 1974. She'd watched those bushes yellow and curl and die, row by row, season by season, as Ridgeback Materials expanded its blast radius and the calcium dust drifted south across the creek. For Alma, the quarry wasn't a business problem. It was personal. It was a slow-motion funeral she'd been attending for 20 years. So when Silas turned to her, this 19-year-old grandson of hers, wiry and lean, standing there with his hands in the pockets of his olive-green work jacket, and said, "Grandma, I think the dust can fix what the dust broke." Alma looked at him the way you look at someone who just suggested you shake hands with the man who burned your house down. She said one word: "No." And that word carried 50 years of weight. But Silas had numbers, and numbers don't care about history. He flipped the notebook to another page. Here's what he laid out, and pay attention, because this is where the whole thing pivots. Ridgeback Materials produced roughly 11,000 tons of calciumite waste dust per year. Fine powder, too calcium-heavy for construction aggregate, too ite-rich for standard landscaping fill. Useless to them. And disposing of it cost Ridgeback somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 annually. Trucking fees, landfill permits, environmental compliance paperwork. Dale Schuster's operation was literally paying money to get rid of the exact mineral compound that Silas had just spent 8 weeks proving could double crop yield in acidic soil. What if the Cobbs took it? For free. On their terms. In controlled quantities, mixed at the ratios Silas had already tested. Ridgeback saves tens of thousands in disposal. The Cobb farm gets an unlimited supply of the one amendment their dying fields desperately needed. 2 possibilities sat on that kitchen table. Either this was the most creative thing anyone in the Cobb family had ever attempted, or it was the desperate hallucination of a broke teenager trying to make peace with the thing that was killing them. June stared at the numbers. Alma stared at the wall. Neither said yes, but neither said no again either. And for Silas, that was enough. The next morning, he got on his bicycle. Now picture this. Really see it. A 19-year-old on a rusted 10-speed, pedaling north on the county road toward a limestone quarry that processes 400 tons of rock a day. The road gets whiter as he rides. Not metaphorically, literally whiter. The dust coats everything. The gravel shoulder turns pale. The fence posts along the road look like they've been dipped in flour. The air tastes like chalk and diesel. He can feel the blasting before he hears it. A low thud in his chest, then the crack rolling across the valley like distant thunder. Then the plume. A gray-white column rising above the tree line like a signal fire. The Ridgeback Materials facility sat on 200 acres of stripped hillside. Conveyors, crushers, settling ponds, dump trucks the size of small buildings. The office was a prefab trailer with vinyl siding and a gravel parking lot full of pickup trucks that each cost more than everything the Cobb farm had earned in the last 3 years combined. Silas leaned his bicycle against a chain-link fence, pulled the composition notebook from his back left pocket, tucked a mason jar of amended soil under his arm, the same soil from his test beds, dark and rich and alive. And he walked in. Dale Schuster was behind his desk, broad-shouldered, stocky, salt and pepper hair receding above gray-blue eyes that looked at Silas the way you'd look at a stray dog that wandered into a board meeting. The Ridgeback Materials logo patch sat on his left breast pocket. The silver ballpoint pen was clipped right beside it. He didn't stand up. Silas set the jar on the desk. set a single sheet of paper next to it, a breakdown of Ridgeback's estimated annual disposal costs, sourced from public permit filings. And he made his pitch. Controlled pickup, scheduled quantities, free removal of waste material that was costing Ridgeback a small fortune to truck out. Schuster listened. He actually listened, which was worse than being ignored, because listening gave him ammunition. When Silas finished, Schuster leaned back in his chair, looked at the jar of dark soil, looked at the cost sheet, and then looked at Silas with the kind of smile that isn't really a smile at all. It's a door closing. "Son, we've got engineers," he said. "We don't need farming advice from a kid." That word, kid. He let it hang there like a verdict. But here's the thing that mattered more than anything Dale Schuster said in that trailer. He didn't throw the jar away. Dale Schuster set the jar of soil on his desk, glanced at the single sheet of paper showing Ridgeback's annual disposal costs, and said, "Son, we've got engineers. We don't need farming advice from a kid." But he didn't throw the jar away. And that was the first mistake he made. Silas didn't wait for Dale Schuster to call back. He couldn't afford to. So he scaled up with what he already had. The dust that fell on their land for free, whether they wanted it or not. And here's the thing about not waiting. It costs you something else. It costs you sleep. It costs you skin off your palms and aches in your shoulders that don't fade by morning. It costs you the kind of exhaustion that sits behind your eyes like wet sand. But Silas Cobb had already done the math in that small, black-covered composition notebook. And the math said one thing clearly. The limestone fines drifting onto the east fence line every single day were enough. Enough calcium carbonate. Enough etitite, micite, 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 micite. Wait, let me back up. Enough calcium carbonate to build something real. He started in late July. Dawn. The air already thick and warm, smelling like iron and cut grass. Silas hauled a borrowed wheelbarrow along the east fence, scooping the pale gray dust that had settled overnight into mounds. Then he layered it. Limestone fines on the bottom. Then a thick bed of composted cow manure from the neighbor's dairy operation. Traded for, not bought, because he had no money to buy anything. Then kitchen scraps. Then another dusting of the calcium-rich fines. Then straw. Then more dust. Windrow after windrow. 12 of them eventually, each about 40 feet long and waist high, running parallel to the fence like ribs on some enormous buried creature. Every 2 days he turned them, by hand, with a pitchfork that had a cracked handle wrapped in electrical tape. The pale green eyes squinting against the dust he kicked up, the faded olive-green canvas jacket tied around his waist because the heat was brutal, that sandy brown hair dark with sweat. He monitored temperatures with a probe thermometer he'd found at a yard sale for $3. He recorded everything, every reading, every observation. The notebook's pages started curling from moisture, so he wrapped it in a plastic bag before tucking it back into his left rear pocket. June watched from the porch. Her arms crossed, always that straight-backed tension holding her upright like a wire. The thin gold wedding band on her right hand catching the light when she shifted. She didn't say stop. She didn't say go. She just watched her son work, and the skepticism in her hazel eyes was quieter now. Not gone, but quieter. However, here's what nobody expected, including Silas himself. Late August. The heirloom tomatoes came in. Now, the Cobb farm had grown tomatoes for decades. Alma remembered when the soil was so rich you could smell the sweetness on the vine from 20 feet away. But those days were gone. The last few seasons had produced fruit that was pale, mealy, watery. Tomatoes that tasted like a memory of a tomato. The kind of thing you slice onto a sandwich and immediately regret. These were different. The first one Silas pulled off the vine was so red it looked fake, like someone had painted it. The skin was tight and warm from the sun, and when he bit into it, right there, standing between the rows, the juice ran down his chin and tasted like summer had been compressed into a single mouthful. Sweet. Not sugar sweet. Earth sweet. A depth of flavor that hit the back of your tongue and stayed there. The kind of tomato that makes you close your eyes. And there's a reason for that. The composted limestone had done something beautiful to the soil chemistry. The calcium had strengthened the cell walls of the fruit, which concentrated the sugars inside. Brix content, that's the measure of dissolved sugar in the juice, was through the roof. Where a typical grocery store tomato sits around 4 or 5 on the Brix scale, these were testing at 9, maybe 10. The calcium hadn't just fixed the pH, it had turned ordinary heirloom seeds into something extraordinary. But Silas didn't have a Brix meter. He didn't need one. He had something better. He had Chef Maren Solberg. She drove down from the city in early September, a Wednesday, in a dusty black sedan that looked out of place on the gravel road. Someone at the farmer's co-op had mentioned the Cobb tomatoes to someone who mentioned them to someone who put Maren's name in Silas's ear. He'd called her restaurant, left a message, didn't expect a call back. She called back in 4 hours. Maren walked the rows with Alma shuffling beside her, the old woman's silver-gray hair in its low bun, the brass soil knife handle poking from her navy cardigan pocket, her deep brown eyes watching this stranger with careful warmth. Silas handed the chef a tomato still warm from the afternoon sun. She bit into it. And then she went quiet. That silence. Pay attention to it. Because that silence was the sound of everything changing. A chef who runs a restaurant that sources high-end local produce doesn't go quiet because something tastes good. She goes quiet because something tastes impossible. Because it tastes like it shouldn't exist in soil that's been degraded for years by industrial runoff. She ordered everything. Every tomato Silas could grow. Then she asked about peppers, squash, herbs, whatever else that soil could produce. She wanted it all. Word got out fast. Other farmers in the valley started asking questions, showing up at the east fence, staring at the windrows, scratching their heads. Their own fields were suffering the same pH collapse, the same calcium depletion, the same slow death. And here was this 19-year-old kid with compost piles made of free dust, growing tomatoes that a city chef was paying premium prices for. What is he doing differently? And that question, that exact question, is where the story pivots so hard it nearly breaks. Because Silas heard it. He heard it from 3 different farmers in 1 week. And somewhere between the third question and the walk back to the house, he pulled out the black composition notebook and wrote 2 words at the top of a fresh page. Sell it. Not the tomatoes, the amendment, the composted limestone blend itself. The thing he'd been making for his own soil. The layered, cured, calcium-rich compost that had resurrected his family's dead fields. Other farmers needed it. Desperately. And they couldn't make it themselves because they didn't have a limestone quarry dusting their fence line every night. But Silas did. What started as survival had just become a product. What started as a kid trying to save 43 acres had just become a business model. And what had been a small, annoying noise the constant hiss of calcium dust settling on everything the Cobbs owned, had just become, and I need you to hear this clearly, a catastrophic opportunity. The kind that scares you. The kind that keeps you up at night, not because it might fail, but because it might actually work, and you're not ready. Silas wasn't ready. But the dust kept falling, and the numbers in his notebook kept growing. Dale Schuster's truck pulled onto the Cobb property one evening in September. He was holding the jar. He'd had it tested by Ridgeback's own lab, and the numbers, the calcium to organic ratios, were nearly perfect. But Silas didn't smile, because he'd already planned what to say next, and it was going to change everything. Dale Schuster didn't walk away. He couldn't. Because Silas wasn't asking for charity. He was offering Ridgeback Materials $140,000 a year savings, and all it cost them was some screened dust and a facility that would make their environmental reports look like poetry. Here's what Silas laid out that September evening, standing in the kitchen with his black-covered composition notebook open to a page he'd written 6 weeks before the lab results even came back. He'd already done the math. Ridgeback was spending over $12,000 a month hauling limestone fines to a licensed disposal site 40 miles south. Fuel, labor, tipping fees, manifests, compliance paperwork, all of it, just to get rid of something the earth was literally begging for. Silas proposed a permitted composting facility on the Cobb property, funded by Ridgeback, operated by the Cobbs, where screened limestone fines would be delivered on a controlled schedule and blended into the organic compost system he'd already proven worked. Dale's gray-blue eyes narrowed. His thick arms folded across that khaki shirt with the Ridgeback logo patch. The silver pen clipped to his pocket caught the kitchen light. "You want us to build you a facility, on your land, with our money." That's what he said. Like Silas was running a con. But Silas flipped the notebook to another page, showed him the disposal invoices he'd pulled from public filings, showed him the projected EPA compliance costs for the next 3 years, showed him a draft letter, already written, to the State Environmental Board, outlining how a permitted agricultural composting partnership would qualify Ridgeback for a waste diversion tax credit they weren't currently claiming. Dale Schuster stared at that page for a long time. Then he looked at June, standing straight-backed in the doorway with her arms crossed, that thin gold wedding band catching the same light as his pen. He looked at Alma, sitting at the table with her brass soil knife resting beside her tea. He didn't say yes that night. However, and this is the part that mattered, he didn't say no. 3 weeks later, Ridgeback's corporate counsel approved the agreement. 4 weeks after that, a concrete pad was poured on the north side of the Cobb property. A proper windrow composting facility. 3 long turning bays with drainage channels. A screened receiving area where Ridgeback trucks could deposit pre-sifted limestone fines into covered bins. A curing shed. A mixing station with a refurbished tractor-mounted turner that Silas found at a county equipment auction for $1,100. The infrastructure of turning waste into wealth doesn't look glamorous. It looks like concrete and corrugated metal and PVC pipe, and a 19-year-old in a faded olive green canvas jacket checking moisture levels with a probe at 6 in the morning. It smells like biology doing its job. Warm, fungal, alive. The windrows steamed in the cool autumn air like the land itself was breathing. But here's where the story turns again. By the following spring, the Cobb farm wasn't just selling produce, they were selling soil. Silas designed the bags himself. Heavy-duty brown craft paper, 25 pounds each, with a simple black label. Limestone black, Proprietary soil amendment. Calcium-enriched organic compost. Below that, in smaller type, from the Cobb Farm, Harlan County. The first batch sold at the Saturday market in March, 40 bags, gone in 2 hours. Not because of marketing, because neighboring farmers had watched the Cobb place go from a dying, dust-choked failure to the darkest, richest topsoil in the county in under a year. And they wanted to know the secret. Now the secret had a price tag, $8 a bag. By June, they couldn't keep up. Hardware stores in 2 counties started carrying it. A regional garden center placed a standing order for 200 bags a month. Revenue from limestone black alone hit $4,000 in July, then $6,000 in August. The produce, the tomatoes, the squash, the peppers growing in that transformed soil, was pulling another $3,000 a month from restaurant orders and market sales. Combined monthly income? More than the Cobb Farm had grossed in any full year of the previous decade. Now, remember the very beginning of this story? The auction room, the laughter, the young man bidding on something everyone thought he couldn't afford. That was this past October. Silas Cobb, pale green eyes steady, sandy brown hair with that natural leftward part, composition notebook in his back left pocket, stood in a county land auction and bid on the 40-acre parcel adjacent to the Cobb property. The same parcel that had been in foreclosure for 2 years. The same parcel that backed right up to the quarry's southern runoff line. He bid $18,000, cash, from limestone black revenue. The room laughed. Because every person in that room remembered the Cobb Farm as the place that was dying under the white dust cloud. The place Dale Schuster once called already done. The place the county extension office had quietly written off. They didn't know what Silas had built. They didn't know the expansion plans in that notebook, a second composting facility, a soil testing service, a partnership with the state agricultural college that was already in draft. They just saw a lean kid in a work jacket bidding on dirt nobody wanted. He won the parcel. Nobody else bid past 12. The laughter stopped when the gavel fell. It stopped completely when Silas walked out without saying a word. Meanwhile, the restaurant orders didn't just return, they multiplied. That chef who'd gone quiet the previous year, the one who'd stopped buying Cobb produce when the calcium damage was at its worst, she became the loudest evangelist Limestone Black ever had, told every supplier, every colleague, every food writer who'd listen. The Cobb tomatoes, she said, tasted like the soil had memory, like the land was giving back something it had been holding for a long time. The county extension office, the same office where Silas had once sat in a plastic chair as a desperate teenager flipping through soil remediation pamphlets nobody thought he'd understand, invited him to speak at their spring workshop, not as a case study, as the keynote. He said yes, but that's not the moment that matters most. This is. One morning in late October, Alma Cobb walked the East Rows alone, slowly, her silver-gray hair tied in that low bun at the nape of her neck, her faded navy blue cardigan buttoned against the chill, the brass soil knife tucked into the pocket where it always lived. Her worn white canvas slip-on shoes left soft prints in the dark earth between the rows. She stopped, knelt carefully, her hands clasping the edge of a raised bed for balance, pressed her fingers into the soil, not testing it, not measuring it, listening. Silas was standing at the end of the row. He'd been watching her. He didn't move. Alma looked up, those deep brown eyes catching the early light. She held a handful of that dark, living soil. Soil that 12 months ago was chalite and calcium-choked hardpan. And she said 5 words. Your grandfather would have heard it too. Soil talks in whispers. You just have to be desperate enough to listen. Here's the thing nobody tells you. Every system produces waste. Every single one. The quarry, the mill, the factory, the market. And every waste, every byproduct, every runoff, every residue that someone pays money to haul away and forget is an ingredient that someone else hasn't recognized yet. Dale Schuster thought he was dumping poison. Ridgeback Materials thought they were disposing of a liability. The county thought the Cobb farm was finished. Silas heard what the soil was trying to say. The quarry still rumbles on the ridge. The dust still drifts. But now, when Silas sees the white plume rising against the morning sky, he doesn't see a threat. He sees a delivery. And somewhere in the back bedroom, Alma is holding a handful of dark soil, whispering something only the earth can hear.